Well, thanks. Thanks for that. Thanks for the kind introduction. Yeah, great. How do I want to start? I mean, first of all, hey, my name is Christopher Breedlove. What my role is in the world is I'm the director of civic activation for Burning Man Project. Think it's probably a little known fact that in 2014, 2015, we made Burning Man Project into a non-for-profit. And the reason we did that was we were founded by 6 founders who had started an LLC. And I think as time was moving on and as age was moving on, those founders were starting to see that there was a limited runway of how long they could steward this organization and this culture in the way that they wanted to. And so by turning it into a non-for-profit, we were setting the groundwork for really gifting it back to the culture and the community. And so I feel very lucky that, I'm one of the kind of the younger people as on the director level, kind of really looking at where this culture is going. And particularly my role is all about everything else besides that week in the desert, everywhere else but that spot in the desert. But, it all kind of cyclically comes back to the desert. And I actually put together a little presentation, but I wanted to ask, how have any of you been to Burning Man? Yeah, I know you have. Cool, because I think what helps then is I'm going to kind of start at the beginning and kind of bring it out to where it goes. I think sometimes that's a helpful way to do it. And I'm a very visual learner, so I am going to, like I said, share my screen here. Can you see that?
Yep. Yes.
The ultimate question of quarantine. Can you see that? And can you hear me? Cool. So, one of the things that I really love about Black Rock City is kind of this idea of crowdsourced innovation. But really, what does that mean? This is our logo, if you want to call it that, for Burning Man. And what I love about it is that it's very simple and it means both everything and nothing at the exact same time. It elicits a lot of different responses from people. And so when you talk about Burning Man, one of the things that people kind of say first is, right, they're like, isn't it a massive party? And I mean, sure, that's one of the things that's going on there, but there's a lot more. Another question I get all the time is it a bunch of hippies? And I think, again, from one lens, you could see it that way. It's also an unforgiving desert, which I think is paramount to the place that we build. It's a very harsh environment that actually creates a lot of culture that we create there. A lot of people might also label it as an art festival. And while the art is oftentimes the big visual kabam of kind of what you see, again, to me, there's something much deeper happening here. Some would also kind of call it, I think, especially these days, a spiritual experience. This right here is a photo of the temple. Also, you commented, I don't know who it was, I think it was Marcus, on this photo behind me. This is another temple that I'm sitting in. This was built by a London designer. And, this is one of the aspects of Burning Man, and I think a very important one, because I would say that many people today have maybe lost the ability to find a space for spiritual or emotional catharsis. And so Burning Man does act like that for a lot of people. But for me, Burning Man is really a testing ground for new ideas. And this is one of the most exciting aspects of Burning Man to me continually, is to see what people bring into this space. And even more than that, it's an actual city. And so this is an aerial of what Black Rock City looks like on, in full blast with about 80,000 people there. And when I say an actual city, what I mean by that is that, we have our own post office. And so you can mail things in and out of the city for that week and actually get packages. We actually have our own airport. This is a photo of NV88, which is in the United States, the only seasonal temporary airport in the country, and is actual in our airport manual for pilots when they're learning about the different airports around the country. And this is a map of Black Rock City laid over San Francisco. And so you can see it's quite sizable. And we've had to create all of this infrastructure because, in this flat alkaline desert, people living out there for a week need a lot of these services. And some of the services, let's say like medical, are the things that the government requires of us. But then things like the airport and the post office are what the participants actually want to see themselves. This is a photo of an art car, which I would call our public transportation system. This is how people get around besides on bikes. And, another thing that Burning Man is it's one of the largest volunteer events in the world. I think we're very proud of that. And that's a huge tenet of who we are, is that, of our 80,000 participants, about 5,000 of those are considered staff, and 4,000 of those are volunteer staff. And so much of the underpinnings of our operation is all done by volunteers. And I just like this photo because that's a couple guys from my camp building it there. But honestly, okay, so that's a bunch of things of like what Burning Man is, but it's the blank slate of Burning Man that I think may be its most important tenet to it. This is a photo of what the playa looks like when we get there. There's absolutely nothing there, and leave no trace is a huge tenet of ours. So after the event, of course, too, we make sure it looks like this at the end of the day. But okay, it's a lot of things of what it is. How does it work? And I think that one of the happy accidents that we discovered while building Black Rock City is actually that we do human-centered design thinking without knowing it. And that's because we end up coming in and we end up iterating and iterating and iterating over this 1 week a year. And we end up creating things much bigger and much grander than we would have thought, because of that need to tear it down and bring it back up in that cyclical fashion. So, kind of going back to the root, right? Like, where did this even come from? In San Francisco in 1986, these two guys, Larry Harvey and Jerry James, built an 8-foot sculpture for 20 people on the beach. That's where this came from. And, I don't know if the rumor's true, but some say it's because Larry had a hard breakup. And so he wanted to kind of do something as that kind of release of catharsis. And then as it started to go, it started to scale exponential. I mean, these are the population levels, and I only have it up until 2015. But as you can see, we started to kind of double, each year, kind of starting at 20 people. And because we started to scale at this rate, we had to come up with a lot of innovation of how to fit people into some sort of organized format in a landscape that actually has no restrictions. And so I think the city map is one of these really great examples of kind of this iterative design, where in 1992, the founders decided, well, okay, we need to at least have a center to this space, and everything else around it was open. What actually happened was then in 1996, because people could be anywhere they wanted except for in that core, we actually had a couple of accidents. We had a couple of car accidents, we had a couple of fire accidents. And in 1997, the organizers had basically a moment of crisis where they said, okay, what are we going to do? We're either going to shut this thing down, or we're going to go professional. And what's really interesting is our founders actually split over that decision. Half of our founders said, no, the experiment was to be in the Wild West with no rules, and anarchy is the only way. And so that half of our founders left. And then the other founders who wanted to turn this into more of an organized system, they decided to stay. And so in 1997, you can see this map, and this is how they started to think about designing the city. In 1998, we came back and we started to expand that, and we started to come up with some ideas of how we might organize this city, which was, one, we wanted to keep it open to nature so that nature was always a part of our experience. And then B, we wanted to create these radial roads so that you could kind of move in this circular fashion. As it moved on, I think this is, I don't remember, I don't have the year on this one. This is in the 2000s for sure. What we've ended up creating is a fairly complex civic structure, where out on the outer ridges, you have the large scale sound pushing that noise out into the wilderness. Towards the center, you have the quieter areas of the city where the Kidsville and things are. And then we have these plazas and these portals where we actually centralize our civic services. There's only a few things you can buy in Black Rock City, and one of those is ice, because we're in the middle of the desert. Ice is one of those things that we need to make sure people have to stay safe. And so we centralize those ice sales in these different spots. We centralize our medical areas in these areas as well, so that people can start to feel this kind of civic sense of knowing where they are in the city. To me, what's really cool is right, this starts to expand. This is a horrible image as I'm seeing it large, but like these little flames are all of our communities around the world that have decided to join in with us, and they're creating their own cities now. And so this is AfrikaBurn in South Africa, which is 13,000 people. And you can see they're taking a lot of the tenets that we've created, this semicircular kind of city with these plazas open to nature, but they're adapting it to their own landscape. And that's where this iteration, I think, becomes very interesting. You know, another reason we're into iterative design is because of survival reasons. Again, it's this kind of unforgiving desert. And so, you know, as people tried to figure out what they were going to live in the desert, you know, we went and we looked at what other people in desert conditions are living in. So the yurt became a thing that a lot of people decided to live in. But if you've ever built a yurt, it's heavy, it's hard to move, and it takes quite a lot of work. And so a designer ended up creating this, which is now called a hexayurt. This hexayurt is made out of 1 to 3/4 inch foam, uses the same basic designs, but flat packs into 8 sheets. You can fit it on the back of a truck. And also because of the insulation material, it keeps it warm during the night and it keeps it cool during the day. You know, these were invented for Black Rock City. And what's interesting is these have been used by the UN and a couple other relief organizations in relief missions. But what you'll also find with these things as you build these year after year is because they're built with foam, they actually break apart, and they're also take up a lot of room to actually move. And so another community member of ours now created this called the Shift Pod. It's based off the same design tenets. It's also a riff off of an ice fishing house, but this collapses into a tent you can throw on your back and uses the same sort of reflective materials for the weatherization, but is much easier to move. Now you can see these being used in disaster relief in Mexico City. I think this was 2016, 2017. So it's really interesting for me, and this is where I like really get off on this community, is kind of saying, okay, where does something start? How does it move? And then how does it move back into the world? You know, these are kind of some of these design examples. And again, ability to scale quickly. And one last example of that with art is this is my friend and one of an amazing artist, this guy named Greg Fleischman. You know, he was doing CNC furniture in LA, and a couple of our community members saw it, invited Greg to come out to the desert and said, how big could you build something? Well, he decided he wanted to take this on the left, you know, play structure he built for kids, and boom, he starts to build it for adults as that. Now, the next year he comes back and they say, how big can you build it again? And he actually built the temple for our community. And so this structure that you're looking at right here has enough space to fit, I don't know, I would assume 300 to 500 people in it. And there's not a single nail, screw, bolt, or metal fastener on that entire structure. The entire thing is lock fit, and the only metal on it is actually rooting this thing into the ground. And I just think that's another really great example of how very quickly someone can go from furniture design to a play structure up to a building that can be a center place for our entire community. So, you know, that's a lot of stuff of kind of how this works, but I think why does it work is something that I really like to point out for Burning Man, because Burning Man, while I think if you've come from a production background or a festival background, you maybe make some assumptions about how Burning Man works. But I really think what we don't do is some of the most important things in Black Rock City. And one of the things we don't do is we don't predict what you want. What that means is there's nothing for sale except for, like I said, ice. The other thing that we have for sale is fuel, and that's a safety issue. When you have 80,000 people with generators and cars, we can't store over 2.5 million gallons of fuel, and so we had to make that decision. And then the last thing that's for sale is coffee, because people get really grumpy if they don't have caffeine. And so, you know, those are the 3 things that we decided to have for sale in the city. We as an organization don't build any stages. That's all up to the community. We as an organization don't book any performers. That's also up to the community. And we expect you to be responsible. And what I mean by that is that 80% of the city, which is the city and not the big art. With big art, we do have engineers look over drawings to make sure that those things are safe, but 80% of the city is built without any oversight. And it's interesting because we actually, when you come into the city, you actually, when you get your ticket, you're kind of signing off some of that liability, but that liability is for the organization. So that liability in the camps is actually put on the camp producers. And it's amazing what can happen when people take responsibility for their own structures and their own safety. We actually have an amazing safety record for a city of 80,000 people, which again is the 4th largest city in Nevada. And we have less crime and less accidents than any other city that size. And it's interesting when you think about how wild that community and that culture actually is. And we also say that everything is possible, but again, you have to do it. While we do provide grants and while we do provide placement, beyond that, our grants won't cover more than 50% of any project. And, I think that's an interesting way to do it. But one of the things that proves is that you have to go out to the community for the rest of your funding. And what that means is that the community is actually behind you in your vision. And there's a lot of buy-in in that experience, which brings me to this quote, if you build it, they will come. But if they build it, they will never leave. And I think that's one of the things we've really figured out about this culture. And one of the reasons it has continued to be on fire is that, everyone is building their own imagination on the desert, and that keeps people coming back. So that was a big rant about what Burning Man is. But to me, maybe most importantly is, okay, we do this thing in the desert, but who cares? I think you could look at it from a couple of different lenses. Of course, it's really amazing what we can do, but also it's one place kind of in the corner of the desert, and you could think that's kind of insular. But for me, again, one of the really exciting things is that this is a community of relationship and trust. And so year after year, as we do this iterative experiment, people get to meet each other. And we are a very international city. We've got people from Brazil and Russia and India and Israel, Sweden, kind of all over. And what we're starting to see is over time, these connections become stronger and stronger. And the possibility of what we can create together in the world, which I would argue is really what we're trying to do, becomes much more possible. And so, of course, with a lot of things in Burning Man, it starts as art. This is a piece called the Raygun Gothic rocket ship by a crew called 5 Ton Crane. And over on the left, you can see it built in Black Rock City. And in San Francisco, because again, that's where our organization is, we started to say, well, how can we start to help artists place this art in civic institutions? And so this is a shot of it over here on the right, right in front of the Bay Bridge. And one of the things we helped create in San Francisco is the cement pad that this rocket ship is on is called a temporary art pad. At first, when we started to work with the city and we started to say, hey, let's bring some of this big art from the desert into the city, obviously the city government had a lot of reservations around that. They weren't sure if they wanted to buy this piece. Pieces in cities tend to last forever. And so what we were able to agree with the city is we would pour these cement pads and we would actually do temporary art exhibitions for the city, and it's funny how sometimes temporary becomes the new permanent. What it allows the city to do is to say, okay, for a 1, 3, 5 year contract. And what we found is if they like the piece, they'll keep it. And sometimes they want to revolve it out. And actually, I wish I had a photo of this, but I don't. I think one of the most interesting examples of this, kind of at scale is the bridge, again, that you can see behind this rocket. There's an artist named Leo Villarreal, and Leo actually installed a massive LED sculpture on the bridge. But we convinced the city to do it on a 1-year contract. After 1 year, the city loved it so much, they raised themselves over $2 million to do the permanent installation. Now it's an iconic piece in San Francisco. If you're anywhere near the Bay Bridge, you can see this massive LED light piece going. And now he actually has a contract to do 5 bridges in London. And so it's really interesting to see how, again, if you can prove it one place, I think a lot of people find it very comfortable to do somewhere else. And I'll just loop that around by saying what I love about Leo Villarreal is, he's an interactive sculpturalist. And now these days he's known as a light sculpturist, but he never did lights in school. He actually did interactive sculpture. And what got him to do light sculptures is he was camping at Burning Man, and at night he couldn't find his camp. And so one of the things he decided to do was start building these little LED moving sculptures so that he could find his camp across the landscape at Burning Man. And I camped next to him for years. And so this big circular LED sculpture was moving. I go, okay, that's how I get home. And through that experience, he now has this massive iconic piece on the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. But coming back to this rocket ship, you know, again, we proved it as a piece in San Francisco, and now you can see it at the Air Force Museum outside of Denver as a permanent piece of their collection, which I think is really exciting. Another piece that I want to just bring out as kind of how it kind of starts to move into the real world is this is in Londonderry, which is a town in Ireland, and it's a town that has very traditionally been split down the middle by the old school Protestant Catholic split. And David Best, who's the guy who created the temple, actually created this temple on this hill in Londonderry. And this, I think, is a really interesting spot where traditionally the town had actually brought up effigies of their political leaders in this spot and burned them here, you know, as signs of protest. And so an art nonprofit in London called the Artichoke Trust, they partnered with us as Burning Man, and we built this sculpture using students from both high schools and also community colleges in that area. And so one of the things we did is we brought students together to talk about the conflict through building this piece. And we also used it as a job training situation where, because a lot of this was built with CNC, we actually came in and spent a month with students in the local colleges teaching them CNC design. And at the end of this, you know, we actually burned this on the hill. And I wish I had a picture of it, but I didn't put it in this presentation either. But you just have this entire community around this sculpture looking at a symbol of their unity and burning it on this hill, which to me is just, you know, a really beautiful idea of what art can do around binding. And what I love about David now is he's now getting contracted to bring these temples around the world. And so he built one in Nepal to bring catharsis after the earthquake they had there. He also had one in Parkland, Florida, 2 years ago, because we had that big school shooting here in the United States. And so he built this temple with students and families who had lost people in that school shooting, and then burned it there on the spot where the shooting happened, again, as a moment of cathartic release. And yeah, I wish I could even describe this a little bit better, but I mean, I think until you actually experience it, it's a little maybe ephemeral, but this idea of bringing a piece of art and then letting it go is a really, really powerful statement. And I guess another way I could describe that is, you know, my uncle, he lives in Los Angeles. He's very conservative. He's a contractor, you know, and so with my conservative family, I always talk about Burning Man, and they love poking holes at me about why I do what I do. And I actually showed him some of these photos at the temple one time, and he was really blown away by the artistry of the build. As a contractor, he really connected with that. And then I explained to him that we burned it. And that's when I watched his eyes light up, because as a builder, destroying something that beautiful and with that much effort kind of brought him into that moment of what temporality meant. And I think that is a really important aspect of our culture. And I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I want to show you a couple more just examples in the world. This is our DC event. It's actually built right here in front of the Washington Monument in the United States. And yes, they actually burn that effigy again as an act of catharsis. And so wrapping this all then together, which is, you know, kind of, I think, Nikki, you said Burners Without Borders, you know, really where my love is in a lot of this culture is about how do we bring this into a civic sense, and how can we make this mean something in communities that are not our own. And so that's really the idea behind Burners Without Borders. So for us, that started in 2005 when we were in the city, and the event was just starting up, and Hurricane Katrina started to pummel into the Gulf Coast. And so, especially if you think back in 2005, we didn't have cell phone service out in the desert. Social media was like just becoming a thing. I don't even think Facebook was public yet. And, so this news starts to travel around the city in this very organic way. And people had this immediate and instinctual need to do something. And so about 40 people, over the next 5 days, raised around $40,000 just by putting cash in water buckets. And they gathered up their tools and their camping materials, and they left the event after the temple burn. And as this dusty crew of 40 people showed up in New Orleans, the military said, no, we don't need you. This is a disaster zone. And the Red Cross said, burning what? I don't know. I don't have time for you guys. And they kind of pushed our volunteer crew away. Burning Man was not a known agent at that point. And what happened is this kind of bottom photo you can see, we found this Buddhist temple. And that Buddhist temple had actually just been consecrated the week before the hurricane. And a lot of our volunteers were from our temple crew. And so our temple crew had an affinity with this temple. And they ended up building their Burning Man camp there. And they said, okay, what does this community need? And one of the things that we found is that for people to qualify for emergency housing, according to FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Service, your house has to actually be knocked down. And so if over here on the right, you see if your house looks like that at the end of a hurricane, you actually have to wait in line for a contractor to come through and wipe your cement pad clean for you to get emergency housing. And again, because we are experienced in using heavy equipment to build things, actually destroying things is way easier. So we got a donation of heavy equipment, and for the next 9 months, our volunteer crew lived there. You can see them on the camp on the left. And we actually did over $1 million worth of demolition work for free as a gift to that local community, setting them up so that they could get emergency housing, right? And that was this big aha moment for us as a culture where we said, oh, everything we've been training for in the desert, which is, these volunteer systems, these water systems, sanitation systems, these heavy equipment skills, it's one-to-one for other disaster zones in the world. And I think one of the other things we realized too is that we do things a little bit differently. So one of the things we can do differently is, because this isn't our job, because this is the thing we're doing out of love and as a gift, we're able to, let's say, gather furniture from the disaster zones and build sculptures at our camp in our fire pit. And on Saturday nights, one of the things that we would do is we would burn these sculptures, because that's kind of part of our cultural tenets. But what's really amazing is again, in a disaster zone, if you've ever been in one, there's a massive hierarchy. At the top, you have your government employees, then you have your non-for-profit employees, then you have your non-for-profit volunteers, and somewhere down at the bottom, you have the survivors, and then maybe something we call spontaneous uninvited volunteers, SUVs. But what happens is you build a sculpture like this, and on Saturday night, when people are kind of milling around or drinking or doing whatever they do, there's all of a sudden this heartbeat in the camp. And this hierarchical system that's out there all of a sudden starts to even out around this fire. And what we started to find is that people started to have very real conversations that they couldn't have in these other circumstances. They couldn't have in the government context, where people started to say, what's next? People started to talk about what their neighbors needed. And we really found that art had this central place in the idea of recovery. And so that was really our second big aha in this project and in this moment, is that creativity has a very real place in these difficult situations around the world. And so we came back from this with a founding belief. And that founding belief is that people have the inherent capacity to solve their own problems, and that social transformation is within reach of all communities. And I think that disaster was that key point moment, but we also wanted to decide that we didn't need to wait for a disaster to strike to build community resilience around the world. We could use these lessons, in the meantime. And so you can kind of see I have Maslow's hierarchy of needs over here, which I think is, again, one way that people traditionally look at recovery and disaster relief, where you start at the psychological and the safety, and that's what you really focus on. And the other things like belonging, esteem, and self-actualization are things that happen later. But I think kind of bringing it back to that art moment, what we've actually started to do is we flip that triangle on its head. And what we see is actually safety and self-actualization are needed at the exact same moment. And if we can give people the basics, which is shelter, food, and water, and we can also give people hope, they actually figure out those middle parts of the triangle by themselves. So what that means today for us is that a lot of our community has started to say, what does Black Rock City look like from the air? And over here on the left, you can see a photo of the Zatari refugee camp. There's a lot of people in our community who have started to kind of make these parallels. And so you actually see a lot of our volunteers around the world. These are some volunteers from the AfrikaBurn called Nest. And they're actually building a youth center in this refugee camp. One of the things that we realized doing a lot of this refugee work is that a lot of times, instead of asking us for our skills, people are asking us for our tools. They were asking us for a hammer, a saw, a drill. And so this container right here is a 20-foot shipping container that we turned into a mobile makerspace called the MRU, the Mobile Resource Unit. And we can drop it anywhere in the world and have the tools that we need to do recovery. Again, a lot of times people know exactly what they need, but especially in a refugee context or in a disaster context, if you're a refugee, you didn't bring the tools as you smuggle yourself across the continent. And in a disaster context, you didn't bring the tools because they were probably blown or washed away in that disaster. So by giving people the basic tenets of what they need and not actually relief, they can actually fix a lot of their own problems. And then here actually is a makerspace that we then built in Nepal. What we've also been doing over the last couple of years is we've been doing tool resource donations at Black Rock City, and then we then donate those tools elsewhere in the world. So this is a makerspace with an organization called Communautaire in Kathmandu. This is also, I think, kind of thinking about things scaling now, this is another mobile resource unit that other community members of ours have built and are reutilizing in Florida after the hurricane. And again, so I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do a lot of times is kind of create these toolkits and then ship those out to our global community. Because again, if we can get out of the way, we think that we can actually scale this change much quicker. Okay, I got a couple more things I want to say, and then I want to open it up to questions and chat with you guys. But I do want to say, I think COVID obviously has been a big moment for this entire world. And what's interesting is those examples I kind of just shared around recovery, all of a sudden what we had to figure out is, as recovery, we were used to doing something in a place in a time. And one of the things about COVID that it showed us is that all of a sudden we had to adapt our pattern response to be everywhere and about every subject. And so what we've already started to be able to do is adapt our community organizing models we did on the ground, bring those online. And so one of the things we did is we did weekly roundups with our community. So we did over 37 of these last year, and over 2,000 people called in, and over 180 projects came to these calls to find resources, find support. And one of our projects actually ended up distributing over 2.5 million items of PPE across the United States. And again, it was because the community knew what they wanted to do. They just needed to find each other. And so by creating these nexuses of places to find each other, we were able to do some really great work without really spending a dime. But I want to wrap this all up and kind of say, where do we go from here? I kind of showed you what Black Rock City is. I showed you how the art moves into the world. I showed you how the civics move into the world. But particularly in this moment, as our organization and our community has been having kind of a culture of crisis, because that one thing that everyone knows that we do, Black Rock City, hasn't been able to happen, we've really started to have to look into the future. And what I'm excited about kind of for our future is that the future for us is both digital and analog. And what I mean by analog is it's really rooted in place. And so we have two kind of exciting things that happened this year, which is one, we went virtual into the multiverse. And so we allowed our community to actually create 8 different virtual universes this year of what they imagine the Burning Man culture and community could look like in virtual spaces. Some of them were in VR, so you can see back in the bottom right-hand corner, that's in a program called AltSpace built by Microsoft. In the upper right-hand corner, this is one built on Unreal Engine, which is a video game engine. Over here on the left is one built in Second Life, which is an old school virtual world. But what was really amazing is again, as an organization, we didn't say, all right, we're all going to gather in one virtual universe. We actually opened it up to our community and said, you guys build it. And so our community decided to build 8 different virtual worlds. And I was pretty blown away by what ended up happening. I'll be super honest. I was not excited about it at all. I thought it was going to be super lame. But some really, really interesting things started to happen. And again, you see our community starting to use technology in new ways. And one of the things I got to do is this is a photo of me in AltSpace, but Microsoft actually got to test out a brand new piece of technology where I became the first hologram 3D ported into a virtual universe through a thing called a HoloLens. And so as you can see on the left, everyone else here is this kind of virtual avatar. And I actually got to be the only person, not only in like, real res, but also with legs in this universe. And one of the things that we're really excited about is that even if Black Rock City comes back, we believe that these virtual places are going to be a tenet of our community in the future, because now you don't have to wait to go and experience Black Rock City. You can actually go in right now into AltSpace and discover and walk around virtual Black Rock City in VR. And so part of that tenet for us in the future is going to be rooted in the technological, but the other part is very analog. And so one of the other really exciting things is that we're very lucky that 14 community members ended up giving us private donations so that we could buy this ranch. As you can see, Black Rock City is over here on the right, and this is our new project called Fly Ranch. And so it's 3,600 acres, just 10 to 12 miles away. And what's exciting about this land is while Black Rock City has always been this explosive experiment of 1 week where everyone builds it and tears it down, and we've had a lot of lessons from that. I think a lot of us have been asking, particularly as we're looking at the climate crisis, what happens when we take that explosive week and we stretch it out and we make that experience last all year? And when we look at what that experiment means in right relationship with the ground that we're on and the first peoples of this area too, which are the Paiute or the Numu people. And so what we're starting to do is have a new experiment on this land, stretching that out. And so last week, we actually released some of the designs, but we did something called a Land Art Generator Initiative, where we invited the world to submit designs around power, water, food, shelter, and waste regeneration. We received over 185 projects from around the world of permanent installations for infrastructure on this land. And I'm just going to show you a couple photos. But, oh wait, actually, first of all, I just wanted to say, the reason this land is super special is we have this crazy geyser. It's called Fly Geyser. And what's really cool about this land, sorry, I kind of got a little turned around, is that, again, it has geothermal on it. It has power on it. It has solar on it. And so again, when we think about this kind of sustainable future, we have a lot of possibility on this land. And we now have 10 projects that we've shortlisted. And so we now have the blueprints for structures, which are all viable. Of course, sometimes I think the artist renditions are a little bit more incredible than they might end up being in real life. But we had a judge group of over 40 experts in the fields of land management, of alternative power, of architecture and engineering. And we've started to bring some of these visions to life. And this is a part of our future as well, saying, again, what does our community look like year round in a sustainable fashion? And what can we do when we have a permanent place to bring a lot of these experiments? So just going to kind of wrap that up and just kind of say, I feel like sometimes I get to rant a whole bunch and show you a whole bunch of things, but I always like to end with questions as well. And so these are just 3 questions that are a little bit amorphous, but things that I know that we're constantly thinking about, which is, 1, how do we better connect a global network of inspired individuals? One of the things that we find is that as our network grows in this organic fashion, everyone wants to connect. And sometimes it's really hard for us to figure out how to do that in the right way. Another thing is, how do we economically support a volunteer community? I think a lot of things I showed you are really grand, but honestly, one of the fallbacks sometimes is that because so much of this is done in a volunteer fashion, as we start to move into the future and think about what does this look like in a more year-round fashion, we need to actually come up with new models of ways to support our community, because people can't volunteer forever. And then another interesting question that we're musing on a lot is, how do we decentralize while keeping a strong core? One of the tenets that we're trying to do is continually give our community the power and the authority to kind of build what they want. And yet we need this kind of strong central core to be able to do this connecting across our community. And so those are three of those kind of grand questions that we're continuing to ask ourselves as an organization and a culture. So great. That's kind of my rant at you guys. I hope it was interesting. I kind of wanted to open this up and see if you guys had any questions or wanted to get any clarity on any of these pieces individually.
Thank you so much for this journey. I have a short question. You're saying that the plyer is moving to fly range. And also you said that the desert doesn't forgive. How much is that part of the experience, the wilderness of the desert?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and honestly, I think it's a massive part of it. We're actually hold our event on federal land, and that's a huge headache for us in a whole multitude of ways. There's over 7 different government institutions we have to work through. We pay millions of dollars to the government to be able to host it there, and the community often asks us why we don't move the city. And the reason, one of the biggest reasons we don't want to move the city is that we're in the middle of this alkaline flat that's actually an ancient lake bed. And that's such a huge tenet to where we are, because there's nothing close to you when you're there. And so when nothing is close, even a 50-foot sculpture is grand, and you have this real feeling of being in the middle of the moon or being at the bottom of the ocean. So we're always, if we can, going to keep the event in that alkaline flat where it's away from everything. And I think that's actually one of the interesting things, is that as we move some of our activities over to fly, it's a very different landscape, even though it's 10 to 12 miles away. While that desert flat is very harsh, masculine, dry, difficult, trying to kill you. 10 miles over that ridge, it's actually very wet, very fertile. I would argue feminine. And so I'm actually very interested to see how that starts to change our culture when it's the same desert, but a very different tenet of that desert. I think it's going to start to change what we build. And I think you can kind of see those kind of sustainable regenerative structures. Those are very much informed, I think, by that different landscape.
Very interesting. So basically both, you will have fly range and the event, the festival where we're not supposed. I learned that Burning Man is not a festival and it's not an event. It's a gathering of a global community for 10 days or for 4 weeks altogether, with the deconstruction on the playa. So that will stay, and fly range will be an additional element for a year through experience. Is that right?
Exactly.
Oh, wonderful. And maybe I missed that, but I think one of the key aspects of Burning Man is the Burning Man principles. Mm-hmm. And if not touched, maybe you want to go there briefly, but I'm also curious how much of the Burning Man principles can transfer outside of the playa to a feminine land.
Yeah, well, here, let me pull those up real quick, because I think I have them somewhere right here, and I can just say them, because otherwise I will forget. It's hard to remember all 10. But I will say, yeah, the tenets of the event. So I'll just share this real quick again. Maybe you can see that it might be a little small, but we do have these kind of 10 principles. And where those came from was in 1996. A lot of our community started to say, hey, we want to build this culture elsewhere in the world. And that's what started our regional network. And they wanted a blueprint of how to do it. But again, I think us not telling you what to do is one of the most important things. And so instead of saying, here's a blueprint to create our culture, what we tried to do is we tried to describe what was happening in the desert. And so that's where these 10 principles came from: radical inclusion, gifting, decommodification, You can read them there. And what I really love about these principles is they're descriptive, not prescriptive. You can't actually do these perfectly. I think why they're cultural principles is because they actually describe a way of being that each individual and each community has to figure out for itself. And so, as an example, I think this is a very simple example, but a lot of times these things butt up against each other. I helped create a regional event in Michigan called Lakes of Fire. And when we were starting, there's a big argument about whether we were going to let kids in or dogs. We couldn't let both. And there was an argument around radical inclusion for the kids and radical self-expression for the dogs. Now, kids won because it's actually very important to us as a culture to have family-friendly experiences. And I think that's something that actually surprises a lot of people about Burning Man culture, is how many families are there. But I think it's a good example of where a lot of these things butt up against each other. And, I think maybe one of the other interesting things about these principles is that, our founder, Larry Harvey, said you can't just take one. You have to have all 10 at once. And what I think is really interesting about that all 10 at once is, again, a lot of times these things butt up against each other. Radical self-reliance, being able to handle everything yourself, butts up against the idea of communal effort a lot of times. And so it's that philosophical quandary of how to live with these principles that I would argue is what makes our culture very vibrant and alive. Because unlike something that I would say maybe like the 10 Commandments, which are very cut and dry, these create friction when they rub up against each other. And that friction, I would argue, is kind of where the aliveness of our culture continues to stem from, because a lot of times people have deep arguments around these things. Sometimes it makes us move a little painfully slow as a culture because we have to move through the philosophy. But I mean, just one example right now, as we're talking about leave no trace a lot, one of the things we're kind of talking about is, again, sustainability and regeneration. And so when everyone brings everything off of the playa themselves, a lot of times people don't dispose of things very properly. And so we're having a discussion of whether we want to do compost collection at our event to bring over to our ranch to create new soil. And it's really interesting to be in the middle of that philosophical argument where people say, well, radical self-reliance, we need to teach people how to handle their own trash appropriately. And one of the things I like to bring up is I'm like, well, radically self-reliant for who? As an individual, do I need to keep all of my own trash, or can I give that to my camp? A lot of camps come together to deal with this infrastructure. Okay, well, if it's okay for a camp to deal with the compost, why couldn't our city deal with the compost ourselves? Isn't it more radically self-reliant for our city to collect the compost and then create dirt for agricultural projects 10 miles away, where I think we could someday maybe even grow food that could come into our city? That sounds radically self-reliant to me at that scale. And so it's really interesting, again, is how do these principles butt up against each other? And then also, what scale are we looking at? And that is a big part of the culture. I appreciate you bringing that up. Sometimes I skip it because that can go elsewhere, but it is a very important part of who we are.
And I have one more question before I want to open up for the last few minutes for everyone to ask a question. And that's, how much do I have to attend Burning Man, the event, to be part of the Burning Man community?
Well, I really love the quote, you don't have to go to the Capitol to be a citizen. I would argue that you don't need to come to any of our events inherently. I think that you have to participate in the culture. And I do think that that's one of the things that is really amazing about our global community, whether it's Fuego Astral in Argentina or Tropical Burn in Brazil or Nowhere in Spain. There's a lot of these communities that are doing art in their own communities, events in their own communities. And I would argue, even if you've only in this year gone to a virtual event with us, you can be part of this community if you want to be. And I think that's also I'll bring it back to one last quote that's pretty foundational to our culture. But one of the groups that helped start Burning Man is this group called the Cacophony Society that was doing prankster, Dada-esque experiences in San Francisco in the 80s. And their founding quote was, "You might already be a member." And I think that's a big part of radical inclusion for us, is that some people are burners and they've never been. And honestly, some people have been to 10 of our events and maybe they still don't get it. So I think the culture is what's most important, not whether you've been there or not.
Beautiful. I want to open up the floor to all of you to ask Christopher. I'll check the time. We have 4 more minutes. So.
Yeah. I'm interested in, I mean, it was absolutely fantastic. And certainly I only had one perspective of Burning Man. I've never been, but, you know, you've opened up a whole range of perspectives on that. In terms of some of the, you know, the relief and some of the voluntary activities, are there any formal fundraising activities? I mean, do you have a fundraising model, or is it really down to the community to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a yes and, you know, we do, because we're a non-for-profit at this point, you know, we take a lot of what we make over the ticket sales, which, you know, I would argue, I still think are quite reasonable for a week experience. It's about $400 for a ticket. Of course, you have to bring everything else, but so we put some of that into it, and we do a lot of granting back out to our community. And then we also will partner with our community around different aspects. And we do have a philanthropy team as well that works on special projects.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Maybe one question, Christopher. How did you get in touch in the first place with Burning Man? And was there a kind of a magical moment or whatever was happening that you decided to work for this culture or be part of this culture?
Yeah, well, that could be a very long story, but how I could tell it quickly is that when I was 19 years old, I was in my freshman year of college, and I actually went to school for film and video. I think storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have as humanity, and I decided to go on a road trip to make a documentary. And at the end of that road trip, someone brought me to Burning Man as kind of a gift. So I kind of stumbled into it at a very young age. And, you know, what I'll tell you is I was on top of an art project at night looking out at the city. And there was this moment where I had this overwhelming sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. And I had somehow shown up exactly as who I needed to be. So that was a very powerful moment. And when I came home, I decided to get involved with the culture. And then, you know, I volunteered and worked with them in a variety of aspects over the next decade or so. And so kind of ending up working for them was a right place, right time. My skills were necessary for where we were trying to go with the non-for-profit. But really, it was that moment standing on top of that sculpture where I was like, oh, this is exactly what I thought the world could be and where I want to be in it.
Christopher, thank you so much for this amazing work. We've hit the top of the hour, and I also want to respect your time. That was a beautiful journey, and I've been to 4 burns, and it's still for me so refreshing to get into this. I feel like I really miss it being on the playa, really miss it coming back there. I'm curious to see if there is a back to or a new version. Corona is for many an era where people wait until it's over to go back to somewhere. I'm more of the kind of person who waits to see what are the next versions, how do the next versions look like. We will all see. I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. That was a wonderful journey, wonderful hour, so insightful. I've learned so much new aspects of Burning Man as well, even though I've been there. And I'm really grateful for your time to introduce us to this beautiful community.